And welcome back. 23 days after taking the position as President Trump's national security advisor, Michael Flynn resigns from office over his misleading relationship with Russia. Joining us now for an in-depth conversation, we welcome now political analyst J.C. Polanco, associate professor at Borough Manhattan Community College, Lee Bynes, host of Issues Under Fire. And gentlemen, welcome to the show. And of course, it's always new news coming out of the White House, and this one with National Security Advisor Michael Flynn announcing his resignation. Now, this is what the latest that we know. High-level advisors close to President Trump were in constant communication during the campaign with Russians known to U.S. intelligence and multiple current and former intelligence, law enforcement, and administration. And this is what officials are telling CNN. Exactly what does this mean, first of all, J.C., for the Trump administration? We'll come back to Michael Flynn in a minute.
I think this is bad news for the Trump administration. I think this is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. This is an American issue. Here we have someone that was coming in as the national security advisor, which for Bronxites, you should know that it's a position that doesn't require Senate approval. This is something that is up to the president to appoint. Someone with a lot of power, someone whose responsibility is to examine all of the intelligence that's provided to the White House and then just give the president what's important. Here's a person that's going into that position, making phone calls to the ambassador of Russia and discussing President Obama's sanctions against the Russians for their meddling in our elections. I think this is a very bad day for the Trump administration. And I think it's very important that the party begins to examine the reality of a congressional investigation to find out what happened. Did he do this independently? Did he violate the Logan Act? Did President Trump send him to do this? I mean, there are a lot of questions to be asked, and we could only find out if we have an investigation. If we don't have an investigation, we lose credibility with the American voters. And in addition to that, we really will lose integrity. And I think it's important that we start looking into it.
Where do you go from there, other than the fact that I would only be able to repeat what I said last week, and this is based solely in confusion, insanity, and the like. I mean, you can't, look at what's been happening. It's only been 3 weeks. The country's on fire. People are in the streets. What are they going to do about it? As far as this whole U.S.-Russia relations thing goes, where it went afoul was about 4 years ago, and it never got any better. A lot of it came out of what was going on with Ukraine. Part of the fact that one of the things that President Trump had to do was come out and say, look, in order to put to bed some of the allegations that he may be Russia's man. And so he says, well, look, we're going to have to get, and before we remove these sanctions, we're going to have to get Crimea back. That ain't going to happen. That is not going to happen. So the administration essentially is between a rock and a hard place, because there's too much accusations out there that he probably is a tool, essentially. And so there's almost no way to push back other than that, admit that this is a bad day for the administration.
It should have been a couple of red flags. I think, JC, we pointed out, our viewers just saw just a few seconds ago, that he was fired in 2014 as the director of intelligence under the President Obama's administration. But let's take a look at this. The frequency of the communications in the early summer and the proximity to President Trump raised some red flags with the United States intelligence and law enforcement officials, and this communication was intercepted during this time. Now you have the President Trump now, who is then Donald Trump, just running on the campaign trail, talking about the elections are rigged, and now we have Russia's involvement. What kind of message and what can we take out of this? Because when you talk about elections being rigged, Russia's involvement right now, there's a lot, not just red flags, a lot of black smoke.
There's a lot of there are a lot of red flags, and I don't blame you for bringing up the question. Although, we would only find out the realities and the details and the facts through an investigation. But General Flynn himself was a decorated general, finds himself in a very bad position in 2014, gets fired by President Obama, joins President Trump's campaign, and when he does, he continues to retweet things that we consider conspiracy theories, fake news. His son is another one that continues to tweet terrible fake news and conspiracy theories. So around the Flynn and father and son duo, there were a lot of red flags. And his son was removed from the transition team early on for retweeting nonsense. And Flynn now, comes through and we discover some very bad things about him. We won't know the details of those conversations until there's an investigation, but what we do know is that the sanctions were brought up. And Daren, that's a big deal, because if in fact he was discussing the sanctions that President Obama laid against Russia because of their involvement in the elections, it's a violation of the Logan Act, which prohibits citizens from meddling in international affairs and the affairs of the American government. So that's the real issue. Did Flynn violate the law? Now, we also find out that the FBI was investigating this. Did he lie to the FBI? We got to figure that out too, because that's a crime. So there's an investigation that must happen. I'm really concerned that we won't have an investigation, so that people like yourself in the media don't continue to say things that perhaps aren't even true. But we need to get to the bottom of it. The only way to do it is to ask the questions.
Well, there's a lot of truth. I mean, certainly if he would not be resigning if there wasn't a whole lot of truth to the fact that he's definitely got some shaky and interesting involvement. I want to move a little bit to talk about international relations while we're talking about that. Lee, bring us up to the latest. President Trump having his meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, talking about that those relationships there. What can we learn from this?
Well, we know that Justin Trudeau is like the ultimate diplomat, because when he came to the United States and he stood there with the podium, the first thing he said is, "I'm not here to lecture another leader on how he wants to deal with the country. However, how he wants to defend his country." However, I was in Spain last year, and I was in Madrid, and I happened to look up on the large sign on their city hall in Madrid, and it says, "We welcome refugees." Now, we're talking about a diametrically opposed concepts between the United States and Canada. Canada sent planes, brought 50,000 refugees to the United States, to Canada. We won't even allow one Syrian refugee, period. And they respect diversity. If you're having a problem, if you need some place to live, if you're running from danger, you can come to Canada. That used to be who we are. That's not who the United States is. In my opinion, moving forward and talking about the whole immigration issue, talking about people coming in, from across the southern border, and I would have to ask myself, or if someone asked me, it says, well, if you're coming to the United States, why are you stopping here? Just keep going. Go north. You'll be accepted there. You won't be stopped at the border.
The issue with the refugee crisis, first of all, Trudeau is you can tell he's a very good diplomat, but he's on the opposite spectrum of politics that we know of here in the United States. His politics is very much socialist when you hear his economic policies, and they don't coincide with a lot of the American capitalism that we're familiar with. Now, having said that, I think it's important that we realize that the FBI director did tell us that there was no way that we can actually review and make sure that people coming here from the Syrian refugee crisis are people that have no ties to terrorism. We don't really know that, and the FBI director did tell us that there's no way to assure that we can actually do that correctly. So we have to remember that with this Syrian refugee crisis, it's tough because we are America. We are a country that has always accepted refugees, but now we have an FBI director that tells us we can't really make sure that to know through any background check if the people that we're allowing to come in have no terrorist ties. So that's a really big deal. And I want you to keep that in mind as you study this issue.
Yeah, well, both gentlemen were extremely diplomatic in what they said. One didn't lead into another, and I think it's important that, they felt it was important to maintain relationship, at least for the press perspective, at least for the public perspective.
I don't think that Donald Trump could have afforded to create another enemy. He's only right now, and Canada is such a friendly nation, non-combative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are. When you say that Canada is a socialist in origin, yes, I agree, but they have an extremely solid middle class going on. Everything here in the United States, we're not necessarily living through capitalism, we're surviving it.
Mm-hmm. Walk me back through last week, a lot of controversy last week, of course, with Senator Elizabeth Warren being silenced on the floor of the Senate. A lot of people felt that was wrong. Talk about the Coretta Scott King letter as she began to read Coretta Scott King's letter. JC, looking back at this, and obviously we know that the Attorney General Sessions has now been confirmed. And while he's confirmed, still a lot of talk going on as to whether or not that was right to be done of Senator Elizabeth Warren, who, in her own right has definitely earned some stripes amongst the Senate. When we look back now, what is this going to mean in terms of moving forward with what happened with Elizabeth Warren? We saw other senators actually reading the Coretta Scott King letter, and so it seems like it still has some fire behind it.
Yes, it's unfortunate. It was one of those things where Senator McConnell, the majority leader of the Senate, used an obscure rule to silence Elizabeth Warren. And I think that there's a reason why that rule is in place. For Bronxites and the viewers, there's a rule in the Senate that doesn't allow for fellow senators to disparage each other on the floor of the Senate. And I've seen it before. I've seen it done before. I know that Senator Cruz himself called Senator McConnell a liar on the floor of the Senate. That rule wasn't used against him. But that rule is in place to allow for people to speak freely and to allow for some cordiality to exist in the Senate. Unfortunately, for a couple of days, it was bad news for Senator McConnell. But considering the Trump administration and all the stuff that's coming out of the White House, I don't think Americans will remember that after next week, how Elizabeth Warren was silenced, because at the end of the day, not only do the Republicans have all the votes necessary to push through all of President Trump's nominees to the cabinet, but nothing really changed because he silenced Senator Warren, except a couple of people got upset for a few days.
I want to take a look at her letter right here, and I'll take a look a little bit about what she says. She says in her letter to, and she actually, talked about to Senator Strom Thurmond. I need you to go back to the last one. It says, he says, I don't believe that, Senator Sessions possesses the requisite judgment, the competence, and sensitivity to the rights guaranteed by the federal civil rights laws to qualify for appointment to the federal district court. And that's a little bit about what she said. And if my producer goes back to the other one that we just had before, I'll go back to the other, I think it was a page before. Yeah, and so here, she also said that Mr. Sessions has used the awesome powers of his office in a shabby attempt to intimidate and frighten elderly black voters. For this reprehensible conduct, he should not be rewarded with federal judgeship. And that's a letter that Coretta Scott King wrote to then Strom Thurmond, who was chairman on the Committee of Judiciary for the Senate. When you look at that letter,
you know what? I think I'm going to take this in a completely different direction, because the letter, beautifully written, laid out perfectly. Except I read it, I got the PDF file and all that kind of stuff. I heard different people reading it on the air. But what got me is I just got to the top of the letter. I didn't even have to get to the date. The letter was dated 1986. Martin Luther King died in 1968. So 18 years later, we get this letter indicating that with all of the work he did, the marches in Selma and Birmingham and all that kind of stuff, arm in arm, and the prayers and the protests and stuff like that, 18 years later, we're still there. Fast forward that to 1992. Okay, now we have to understand the history of this. 1992, I was in LA during the Rodney King riots. Rodney King, after the riots and everything like that, he came out and said this famous statement, "Can we all get along?" Okay? At that time, I was willing to try, all right? But then we get to 2014. And you have to ask yourself, because after the riots and everything like that, I started looking at it and it helped me write a book, The Race-Related, The Rise and Fall of the African American. It takes a look at that chunk of time and how it happened. And what I found is that I found, after looking at what happened in Baltimore, what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, what happened right out here on Staten Island, the fact that we were going through this whole thing about stop and frisk in New York, it had to be challenged from the standpoint of constitutionality. And then here, that was in 2014 when I wrote that book. Here we are, 2017, and we got this Coretta Scott letter out being read not by a black person, probably would have given a lot more steam if, say, Martin Luther King III had made that. But here we are, nothing against white America or anything like that, but why do we need a white woman to make our case in this particular situation?
Well, JC, let me ask this. So when you talk about the letter itself, obviously it was dealing with Jeff Sessions and really talking about the fact that there's some strong adversarial tones to his nomination. How much weight did you think that was really going to hold going forward in that nomination? I mean, Elizabeth Warren kind of used it as a trump card, for lack of a better word, and it didn't work.
No, it had no weight, not at all. Listen, this election in November was clear. The Republicans were going to control the Senate. Republicans were going to control the House, and the Republicans were going to control the White House. So here you have a president that won the Electoral College, and it is his now prerogative to appoint the people that he wants to work with. And guess what? Every appointment that he's put in so far has the votes necessary to be ratified and appointed and be made part of that cabinet. I know that a lot of Bronxites are upset to hear that, but we are a democracy, and you know I was never Trump. But this guy won the election. So he's going to make these appointments. And no matter how much I am upset at the fact that Senator Sessions in 2006 on the floor of the U.S. Senate completely trashed Dominican immigrants and what they bring and contribute to the American economy. And if Bronxers were to take a look at the speech, I think you'd be appalled. I have to recognize that I don't approve of this nomination. I'm very upset about it. But we live in a democracy, so we can pout about it, or you can participate in the democratic process. You could come out and vote. You could hope that the people that you want to win office, so that this doesn't happen. But if you stay home and you don't participate in it, and people in Milwaukee sit home and don't participate because they don't like the candidate, and people in Philadelphia stayed home because they don't like the candidate. This is the reality. And people in Detroit stay home and they don't like the candidate. Well, this is what you're going to get. And we have to understand that democracy and elections have consequences.
You know what?
Sessions is an example of that.
I don't know. I have to disagree with that because of the fact that, where are you from? Where are you from?
The Bronx.
You're
Dominican.
Dominican Republic. I'm not sure about people from the Dominican Republic, but I can say that African Americans or black people have been suffering in this country for 400 years. And to sit back and say that this is a democracy and we just have to find a way to work within the confines of that, I say, I don't know, 400 years is a little too long. I don't really have that much patience. So I'm thinking that African Americans, people of color, should have a plan B. Now, I have a plan B, but this is not the forum or the format to discuss that in. But when we have some time to really do what we need to do, we could talk about that.
So you're saying challenge the democracy system as is?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We could do that. In the meantime, we have to understand that this is the system in place,
Right.
And we have to work with this system, and we really have to make a difference within the system. While you plan that stuff,
We
that's
have to
great.
wait.
But
We
you
have
have to realize that this is the democracy we've been given. We got to work within these confines.
And I got to leave on this note, but within that democracy that we've been given, let's go to this statistic. 45% of eligible voters in America did not show up to vote in this last presidential
How many of those
election.
guys are marching every Saturday,
They
upset
had
at the world?
no choice.
That's true. All right, well, listen, gentlemen, thank you so much. Got to take a quick break. That ends our political segment. When we come back, we're going to talk art. We're going to take you to an art show celebrating Black History Month. Don't go anywhere. We're coming right back in a few.